You are in Athens, sometime in the 5th century BCE. The air is dry, and the sound of cicadas hums faintly in the background. If you walk along the dusty paths leading out from the city walls, past the scattered shrines and the carefully tended farms, you will notice a landscape dotted with olive trees. They are not dramatic in appearance, short, twisted trunks with gray-green leaves that shimmer when the wind passes through, but they are the quiet backbone of Athenian society. For Athens, the olive tree was more than just a plant. It was an anchor of identity, economy, and law. It shaped trade routes, influenced social class distinctions, and played a subtle but enduring role in religion. To count these trees was not an idle task, nor an eccentric whim of bureaucrats. It was, in its way, a matter of survival and order. And in a city that prided itself on precision in law and the organization of its civic life, even the number of olive trees had to be measured, recorded, and sometimes disputed. The sacred and the ordinary. The olive tree carried deep symbolic meaning in Athens. According to myth, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craft, gifted the first olive tree to the city, winning the right to be its patron deity. That myth alone placed olive trees into the realm of the sacred. The Morii, or sacred olives, were said to descend from Athena's original gift. These particular trees were not just common plants. They were registered, guarded, and subject to state oversight. To damage one was not a small matter. It was an offense against both the city and its patron goddess, punishable by fines, exile, or even death. But alongside these sacred trees grew thousands of ordinary ones. Families planted them in their farms and fields, sometimes clustering them in groves, sometimes scattering them along property lines. They required patience. An olive tree could take over a decade before it produced significant fruit. Yet once mature, the tree could live for centuries, passing from generation to generation like a family heirloom. Ownership of olive groves was not just a sign of wealth. It was a promise of stability, a resource that could sustain households long after the original planter was gone. And so the Athenians took stock. They counted. They recorded. In the eyes of the state, knowing how many olive trees stood on a plot of land was as important as knowing how many drachmas of tax were owed or how many men a household could provide for military service. Counting as control. The counting of olive trees was not merely an agricultural matter, it was an act of governance. The city-state depended on olive oil for trade, diet, and religious rituals. Oil fueled lamps, flavored food, and anointed the bodies of athletes competing in the Panathenaic Games. Large amphorae of olive oil were prizes awarded to victors, their painted surfaces celebrating both artistry and abundance. To ensure this system functioned, officials needed to know how many trees existed, where they stood, and who claimed them. Landowners were therefore required to declare their groves. Inspectors, appointed men of the polis, would walk the land, counting trees, examining their age and condition, and sometimes even marking their trunks for official records. These inspectors, known in some contexts as the epimeletai of the Morii, bore the authority of the state. They were not farmers themselves, but administrators, trained in the art of record-keeping. Theirs was not a glamorous duty, but it was essential, to confirm that trees existed, to ensure that sacred ones were undisturbed, and to note changes in ownership or destruction. Counting became a form of surveillance. It tied the household to the state, the farmer to the larger civic machine. A tree was not simply a tree, it was an entry in a ledger, a figure in a calculation of wealth, a piece of data in Athens' early experiments with bureaucracy. The method of the count. Imagine the process itself. An inspector arrives at the edge of a farm. He is accompanied perhaps by a scribe carrying wax tablets. The farmer follows, slightly anxious, knowing that the accuracy of this count might affect his taxes or his inheritance claims. The inspector begins at the boundary, noting the placement of the first trees. He counts slowly, methodically. He checks for signs of health. Are the leaves full, the trunk sound? He looks for signs of deliberate destruction, for sometimes land disputes tempted men to cut down a neighbor's tree under the cover of night. Each tree receives its place in the record. The scribe scratches numbers into the wax, perhaps making small notations about the tree's size or its proximity to the road. If the farm is large, this process could take hours, even days. To walk among a grove and account for each gnarled trunk was to immerse oneself in the slow rhythm of the land, to witness the patient permanence of a crop that defied the quick cycles of grain or barley. This counting was not hurried. There was no room for carelessness. Errors could mean disputes later, and disputes over olive trees were anything but trivial. The value of a single tree. Why so much fuss over individual trees? Because each tree represented value in multiple forms. Economically, one mature olive tree could produce enough fruit for several liters of oil each season. Multiply that by dozens or hundreds of trees, and you had a steady income, a product that could be sold abroad or stored against future hardship. Legally, trees were property markers. A single olive tree could define a boundary between farms. Destroying one might erase evidence of ownership. Families wove them into dowries and inheritances, passing them along as part of the household estate. Religiously, as noted, some trees held sacred status. To distinguish a common olive tree from a sacred one was no small matter. Inspectors carried the authority to determine such classifications, and those decisions shaped the lives of landowners. Thus, the count was not just arithmetic. It was a declaration of value, of lineage, of belonging. Each recorded tree was a legal fact, a piece of the puzzle that defined who owned what in a society deeply concerned with fairness, order, and civic duty. The atmosphere of the count. Consider what this process felt like, both for those who counted and those whose trees were being counted. For the inspectors, it was routine. Day after day, they trudged through fields making notations, dealing with anxious farmers. For the farmers, it was a moment of vulnerability. They had to trust that the count would be accurate, that the officials would not misclassify their groves or overlook trees that had stood for decades. The process itself was monotonous, but within that monotony lay tension. A miscount could mean higher taxes. A mistaken classification could strip a family of a valuable tree. Whispered accusations of bribery sometimes followed inspectors. And in a society where reputation mattered, disputes over something as small as an olive tree could grow into years-long feuds. Boredom and significance. At first glance, the act of counting trees seems unremarkable, even dull. Yet in the quietness of this bureaucratic process, you can glimpse the deeper mechanisms of Athenian society. It reveals how a city-state balanced the sacred and the practical, how it imposed order on nature, and how it tied individual households into the larger civic system. To walk through the olive groves of Attica with an inspector was to see Athens from the ground up, from the roots of its economy rather than the lofty speeches of its politicians. It was here, among the twisting branches and the endless counting, that the stability of the polis was maintained. And yet, for all the care and caution, disputes inevitably arose. If two neighbors both claimed the same tree, whose record would prevail? If an inspector declared a tree sacred when a farmer insisted it was ordinary, who had the authority to decide? It is here, in these conflicts over a single tree, that the story deepens, where bureaucracy meets human ambition, and where a quiet grove becomes a courtroom of sorts. The count, in all its quiet monotony, carried with it the seeds of conflict. To the inspectors, a tree was a legal entry to be recorded. To the farmers and landowners, it was livelihood, inheritance, and, in some cases, survival. Whenever numbers were entered into wax tablets and scrolls, disputes inevitably followed. The olive tree, though silent and unmoving, became a point of contention, its roots sunk deep not only in soil, but in law, family honor, and even religion. Property lines and ancient boundaries. Athens, like much of Greece, had farmland parceled out in irregular patterns. Unlike the neat squares of later Roman surveys, Attic fields were bounded by winding paths, scattered stones, or the natural curves of streams and hills. Olive trees often grew along these borders, either deliberately planted as markers or springing up over decades from seeds dropped by birds or carried in the wind. When inspectors made their count, these border trees often caused confusion. A single tree with its trunk leaning across two properties could spark years of disagreement. To whom did it belong? Was the tree shared, or did the property line cut directly through the roots, leaving ownership ambiguous? Such disputes were not idle grumblings. Inheritance laws in Athens were precise, and land was divided with care among heirs. A single olive tree could become a matter of litigation if it shifted the balance of a dowry or altered the portion of a son's estate. In these cases, men would turn to the courts, bringing neighbors, surveyors, and inspectors to testify. Olive trees in the courts. The Athenian legal system, though famous for its speeches and jury trials, also dealt with mundane cases like tree disputes. Court records, fragmentary though they are, suggest that lawsuits over property lines, boundaries, and agricultural claims were not rare. Imagine an Athenian farmer standing before a jury of his peers, not to argue over matters of war or politics, but to assert that the olive tree at the edge of his field was unjustly claimed by his neighbor. He might summon witnesses, older men who remembered the planting of the tree, or family members who could testify to the inheritance of the land. The inspector's records would be produced, carefully unrolled and read aloud. The jurors, citizens with little patience for agricultural minutiae, would nonetheless deliberate on whether the tree in question was rightly recorded. A verdict in favor of one party could alter the distribution of land, affect taxation, or redefine a family's wealth for generations. Sacred trees and legal peril. Even more serious were disputes involving the Morii, the sacred olive trees said to descend from Athena's original gift. These were not mere agricultural resources. They were state property, guarded by law. Inspectors were tasked with recording them separately, ensuring their survival, and reporting any damage or destruction. The consequences of tampering with a sacred tree were severe. Cutting one down or even damaging it was a crime against the state. Historical anecdotes mention men being fined heavily or even exiled for offenses against the sacred olives. For landowners, having a sacred tree on their property was both a blessing and a burden. It tied their farm to divine favor, but it also meant surrendering control to the state. If an inspector declared a tree sacred, the landowner could not dispute it lightly. Yet there were cases where such declarations were contested. Was the tree truly descended from Athena's gift? Or was it simply an ordinary tree mistakenly or conveniently classified as sacred? To argue against an inspector's word was risky, but sometimes families felt compelled to protect their rights. These cases carried higher stakes, for here the question was not just ownership, but piety and loyalty to the gods. The emotional weight of olive trees. For all the legal precision, disputes over olive trees carried emotional weight. Families poured decades of care into their groves. A single tree might have been planted by a grandfather, tended by a father, and passed on to sons and daughters. To lose such a tree through a legal ruling was more than economic, it was personal, a loss of memory and continuity. In oral testimonies preserved in fragments, disputants often spoke of lineage. My father planted this tree before the archonship of, or this tree has stood on our boundary since the time of. Such statements reflected the intertwining of family history with the natural growth of the grove. Trees marked not only land but lives. Inspectors under suspicion. Given the weight of these decisions, inspectors themselves were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Accusations of bribery or favoritism circulated. A wealthy landowner might attempt to sway the record in his favor, persuading an inspector to overlook a tree or to classify it differently. Although Athens prided itself on civic integrity, human weakness persisted. Juries occasionally had to consider whether an inspector had acted honestly or whether the numbers had been manipulated. In such cases, the reputation of the official was at stake, and his word could be challenged before the assembled citizens. The bureaucracy of counting olive trees, meant to bring order, often revealed the cracks of human ambition and distrust. Broader implications, trade and taxes. Beyond family disputes and sacred obligations, the count of olive trees influenced broader Athenian policies. Olive oil was one of Athens' chief exports, carried across the Mediterranean in ceramic amphorae. Knowing the size of local production allowed the state to anticipate trade revenues, manage storage, and levy taxes fairly. If a landowner underreported his trees, he might evade a portion of taxes. If he exaggerated, he risked exposure during an official inspection. The accuracy of these counts affected not just individuals, but the state's ability to project wealth and influence abroad. Thus, olive trees, in their quiet ubiquity, formed part of the economic backbone of Athens' empire. The disputes that arose in their shadow were, in miniature, reflections of the tensions between private interest and public good. A quiet but powerful conflict. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to overlook these disputes as trivial. Yet for Athenians, they carried genuine stakes. The olive tree embodied the convergence of economy, religion, and law. To contest one was to enter into the most practical and most sacred spheres of Athenian life. And so the courts echoed not only with the rhetoric of great statesmen, but with the quieter voices of farmers defending their groves. Inspectors, scribes, and jurors all played their roles in shaping the landscape of ownership. Behind each dispute was a deeper question. Who truly controlled the land of Attica, the families who had tilled it for generations, or the state that claimed to speak with the authority of gods and laws? The count, then, was never just a record. It was a negotiation, a balancing act between individual rights and civic oversight. But what happened when disaster struck, when trees were destroyed, whether by natural causes, war, or deliberate acts? That is the next chapter in our story. How the destruction of olive trees and the records surrounding them reshaped lives and tested the resilience of Athens itself. The act of counting olive trees was meant to impose order. Yet, no matter how meticulous the inspectors were, no matter how carefully scribes etched numbers onto tablets, nature and history refused to stay still. Trees died, were cut down, burned in war, or withered in drought. Records aged and decayed, sometimes preserved in archives, sometimes lost in floods or fires. What mattered most was not the permanence of the count, but the city's capacity to respond to change. And in Athens, the olive tree, both fragile and enduring, stood at the center of this dance between destruction and resilience. Natural destruction, drought and disease. Olive trees are hardy, but they are not invincible. Years of drought could wither their leaves, shrivel their fruit, and leave their twisted trunks hollow. Disease, too, posed threats. Ancient writers speak of infestations, blights, and mysterious die-offs that struck groves across Attica. For families dependent on these trees, such losses were catastrophic. A barley field could be replanted the following season, but an olive tree lost was a decade's investment gone. The inspectors' ledgers recorded not only the living but the dead. When inspectors returned to a grove and found trees no longer standing, they noted the absence, marked the loss, and adjusted the records accordingly. Behind those notations lay silent tragedies, families facing reduced oil yields, diminished trade opportunities, and uncertainty in inheritance. In these cases, the count became not a record of prosperity, but a catalog of absence. War and the olive groves. Yet the greatest destruction often came not from nature, but from war. The Peloponnesian War, which dragged on for decades, saw Attica invaded repeatedly by Spartan forces. These invaders did not merely fight battles, they sought to cripple Athens' ability to sustain itself. Groves were burned, trees cut down, land desolated. The olive tree, with its deep cultural and economic significance, became a deliberate target. Contemporary accounts note that some sacred trees, believed to descend from Athena's original gift, were damaged in these raids, sending waves of religious unease through the city. If the goddess's trees could be harmed, what protection was left for ordinary men and women? Inspectors, in the aftermath, returned to count what remained. Their records tell of reduced numbers, charred trunks, and the loss of groves that had stood for generations. The act of counting after war was not merely bureaucratic, it was an acknowledgement of wounds, a collective recognition of what had been destroyed. Replanting and patience. And yet Athenians replanted. Olive trees demand patience, and patience was a trait cultivated through necessity. Families who lost groves began again, planting saplings that would not bear fruit for a decade or more. They did so not for themselves, but for their children and grandchildren. This replanting was itself an act of resilience, a declaration that Athens would endure beyond drought, beyond war, beyond the shifting fortunes of politics. Inspectors noted new trees, small and fragile, marking them in ledgers that would long outlast the planters. In this way, the count became a record of hope as much as of loss. The fragility of records. Yet records themselves were fragile. Wax tablets could be erased, scrolls eaten by insects, archives destroyed in fires. What survived was uneven, scattered, sometimes contradictory. Modern historians, piecing together fragments from inscriptions and literary references, can glimpse the bureaucratic machinery but not reconstruct it fully. This fragility mattered in Athens too. When records were lost, disputes flared anew. If two families both claimed a tree and the inspector's notes had burned in an archive fire, how was ownership to be proven? Memory became the courtroom evidence, and jurors weighed testimony against testimony in the absence of written proof. Thus, the olive tree existed in two worlds: the physical grove, where it grew slowly and silently, and the fragile archives, where it lived as an entry in a record subject to decay. Between the two, Athenians navigated the uncertainties of property, inheritance, and civic order. The olive tree as metaphor. By the time you step back from these details, the disputes, the counts, the destroyed groves, you begin to see the olive tree as more than a crop. It was a metaphor for Athenian life itself, deeply rooted, capable of enduring centuries, but always vulnerable to forces beyond control. Athenians lived with this duality. They cherished the longevity of their groves, telling stories of trees planted by ancestors. Yet they also accepted that storms, wars, and accidents could erase decades of growth in a single moment. The bureaucracy of counting trees, dull as it seemed, was one way the city attempted to wrestle with this tension, to give permanence to what was never truly permanent. Reflection and legacy. When you consider the great achievements of Athens, its philosophy, its drama, its architecture, the counting of olive trees seems trivial. But if you shift your view downward, toward the soil and the groves, you see the quiet scaffolding that supported those achievements. Without olive oil to light lamps, feed citizens, and fuel trade, the city's cultural brilliance would have struggled to shine. The inspectors, walking among groves with stylus and tablet, were part of that scaffolding. Their records preserved order, settled disputes, and linked households to the state. They were, in a sense, caretakers of Athens' silent foundation. And in this way, the olive trees of Attica shaped history not through dramatic battles or heroic deeds, but through their slow growth, their careful counting, and their quiet endurance. Closing thought. The olive tree count reminds us that history is not only made in moments of glory, but also in the slow accumulation of ordinary acts of counting, recording, disputing, and replanting. These acts, though boring, formed the bedrock of a society that still fascinates us millennia later. And so we end this first story with a question. If the quiet counting of olive trees could shape the destiny of Athens, what other hidden, overlooked labors of ordinary people lie beneath the surface of history's grand narratives? When you think of Sparta, you probably picture warriors. Bronze armor gleaming in the sun, scarlet cloaks whipping in the wind, men trained from childhood to march in step and fight without fear. The Spartan warrior became legend, a figure celebrated in tales of Thermopylae and remembered as the embodiment of discipline and strength. But behind this image stood a quieter, steadier foundation. For every man who stood in line with spear and shield, there were women at home, managing households, accounting for food, weaving cloth, and keeping meticulous records of inventories. Spartan women, particularly mothers, bore responsibilities that were no less crucial than their husbands' or sons' feats on the battlefield. This story begins not with a battle, but with a storeroom, a city shaped by absence. Sparta was unique in the Greek world. From the age of 7, boys left home to enter the agoge, the rigorous system of training that forged them into soldiers. By adulthood, men spent much of their lives in barracks or on campaign, returning to their homes rarely and often only to sire children. This meant that women managed estates almost independently. In most Greek polis, women's roles were confined to the domestic sphere under the authority of male guardians. But in Sparta, necessity reshaped custom. Women inherited, owned, and controlled land. They managed helot laborers, the enslaved population who worked the fields and oversaw the flow of grain, oil, wine, and wool. Thus, Spartan mothers became the stewards of household economies. Their ability to track inventories, plan distributions, and ensure stability underpinned the very survival of the warrior state. The storerooms of Sparta. Picture a Spartan household. It is not lavish in the way of Athens, with painted pottery and elaborate furniture. Spartan ideals prized simplicity, even austerity. But simplicity did not mean disorder. In storerooms carved from stone or constructed with timber beams, jars of oil and amphorae of wine lined the walls. Baskets of barley and wheat were stacked neatly, while sacks of dried figs or lentils waited in corners. Helots, supervised by women of the household, carried in harvests and stored them under careful watch. A good Spartan mother knew exactly how many amphorae of oil she had, how many jars of pickled olives, how many bundles of wool ready for weaving. Inventories were not written down as often as in bureaucratic Athens, but memory, oral tallying, and marks cut into wood or stone sufficed. Spartan women were trained to be sharp and disciplined, reflecting the same ethos that shaped their warrior sons. Forgetfulness or negligence could mean shortages, disputes, or even hunger. Household economics and rations. The most pressing task was managing rations. Every Spartan citizen, male or female, was bound to contribute to the communal messes syssitia, where citizens dined together in simple equality. These meals were supplied by contributions from each household, a certain measure of barley, wine, cheese, and figs, along with money to purchase meat. It fell to Spartan mothers to ensure that these contributions were ready, sufficient, and delivered on time. If a household failed to provide, its male citizen might lose his place at the mess, and with it, his full civic standing. Thus, behind every soldier's meal stood a woman who had counted the grain and measured the oil. Inventories were not abstract, they were directly tied to citizenship, reputation, and honor. The discipline of Spartan women. Ancient observers, especially outsiders like Aristotle, often remarked on the boldness and independence of Spartan women. Some accused them of excess, others of overstepping boundaries. But this independence was rooted in responsibility. Women who managed inventories also managed futures. They ensured that estates remained productive while men were away at war. They supervised helots with firmness, maintaining the labor system upon which Sparta depended. They decided when to sell surplus oil or grain, when to store food against lean years, and how to divide household resources between contributions to the state and the needs of children at home. This discipline echoed the Spartan military ethos. Just as soldiers were expected to master themselves, so too were mothers expected to master their stores. The emotional weight of counting. We should not overlook the human dimension of this inventory work. To count jars and baskets was not a sterile task, it carried anxiety and care. Spartan women raised children knowing that many sons would not return from war. In that uncertainty, the storeroom became both comfort and burden. A well-stocked storeroom was reassurance. The family would survive the winter, the mess contributions would be honored, the estate would endure. An emptying storeroom, on the other hand, stirred unease. Every missing amphora was a reminder of fragility, of how dependent Sparta was on the toil of helots, the cycles of harvest, and the vigilance of women. Inventories as legacy. In Sparta, where men's glory lay in the battlefield, women's legacy often lay in the household record. Stories circulated of Spartan mothers who rebuked sons for cowardice, telling them to return with their shield or on it. But beneath those stern words was another form of strength, the quiet perseverance of managing, counting, and safeguarding the family's lifeblood. A Spartan mother's inventory was not just a list of goods. It was her shield, her contribution to the survival of her city-state. Without it, the warrior society would have starved, its military machine unable to function. The open question. So in the shadow of Sparta's famous battles, we find storerooms, jars, and tallies, quiet acts of management that made the battles possible. And yet, one must wonder, what happened when inventories faltered, when harvests failed, or when women miscalculated their contributions to the communal mess? The Spartan ideal was one of stability, an eternal line of warriors, each generation sustaining the next. But ideals, no matter how rigidly enforced, collided with the unpredictability of life. Harvests failed, helots rebelled, wars disrupted supply lines. Even the most disciplined Spartan mother standing in her storeroom could find herself facing shelves more bare than full. It was in these moments of scarcity that her skills, foresight, and resolve were tested most of all. The fragility of the Spartan system. Sparta's society depended heavily on the labor of the helots, the agricultural serfs bound to the land. Helots tilled the soil, harvested crops, and carried produce into the storerooms overseen by Spartan women. But helot labor was not always reliable. Resentment simmered constantly, for helots lived under harsh conditions, often subjected to intimidation and violence. Periodic revolts disrupted agricultural production, leaving Spartan households scrambling to account for missing harvests. Moreover, Spartan land was not uniformly fertile. The plains of Laconia produced crops, but poor seasons were not uncommon. A harsh winter or dry summer could cut yields dramatically, and when that happened, inventories dwindled with alarming speed. In these times, Spartan mothers became managers of scarcity rather than abundance. Every jar of oil, every basket of barley had to be stretched further, measured more carefully, guarded more closely. Rationing and calculation. Consider the task of rationing in such a crisis. A mother stands in her storeroom, counting the remaining amphorae. She knows that a portion must be sent to the syssitia, the communal mess to which her husband or sons are bound. Without it, their civic status could be questioned, their reputation stained. Yet she also sees the hungry faces of her children, the needs of her household. This was not merely a practical dilemma, it was an emotional one. To fail in either duty could bring shame or suffering. Mothers developed careful calculations, stretching rations of grain with lentils, diluting wine with more water than usual, cutting oil usage in lamps to save reserves. These acts were small, but they reflected the broader resilience of Spartan society. The communal mess as obligation. The syssitia was more than a dining hall, it was the glue of Spartan citizenship. Each man had to contribute his share of food, regardless of household hardship. If a household failed to provide, the male member risked exclusion. To lose one's place at the mess was to lose standing as a full citizen, a disgrace that carried social and political consequences. Thus, even in times of shortage, Spartan women prioritized contributions to the mess. Some sold small portions of surplus wool or cheese to secure necessary goods. Others leaned heavily on helots, demanding more work, more production, to ensure that obligations were met. The pressure of the mess reveals how deeply the Spartan system bound private inventories to public life. A mother's decisions in the storeroom reverberated in the civic order of the city. Shortages in wartime. Wartime magnified these challenges. During campaigns, soldiers often relied on food sent from home. Spartan mothers, already stretched thin, had to prepare extra provisions for sons or husbands in the field. At the same time, enemy raids into Laconia, such as those during the Peloponnesian War, disrupted harvests, destroyed crops, and threatened storerooms. Imagine the anxiety, the pounding of Spartan boots in distant battles, while back home, a mother measures dwindling grain. The connection between battlefield and storeroom was invisible but inseparable. Victory abroad could mean little if families starved at home. Coping strategies. In times of scarcity, Spartan mothers developed strategies that blended discipline with creativity. Diversification of food sources. While barley was the staple, households leaned more on figs, nuts, and legumes in lean years. Sheep and goats provided milk, cheese, and occasional meat, though true Spartan austerity meant meat was rarely a daily meal. Preservation techniques. Drying figs, salting fish, and pressing oil from even small olive yields became crucial. A jar of preserved olives might last through a season when fresh produce failed. Helot exploitation. The harsh reality was that shortages often fell most heavily on the helots. Spartan women, tasked with protecting their own families, sometimes increased demands on helot households, compelling them to supply more than they could sustain. This bred further resentment, fueling the cycle of instability. Through these measures, Spartan women tried to hold the line. They embodied the same relentless endurance expected of their warrior sons, though expressed in storerooms instead of battlefields. The emotional weight of shortage. Shortages were not just economic, they carried emotional burdens. Spartan mothers were expected to show resilience, never weakness. Their role in raising warriors extended into maintaining stoic composure in crises. Ancient writers often remarked on the severity of Spartan women's public demeanor. Behind closed doors, however, the weight of inventory management pressed heavily. To open a storeroom and see empty baskets was to confront the fragility of the household and, by extension, of Sparta itself. Every miscalculation could ripple outward. Fewer rations, weaker children, strained obligations to the mess. The warrior state, for all its martial glory, rested on these fragile calculations. Shortage as a test of character. Shortages also became a test of character. Just as Spartan men were trained to endure hunger and hardship, Spartan mothers were expected to endure shortages with discipline. Complaining was dishonored. Adaptation was demanded. In this way, women internalized the same ethos of endurance as their soldier sons. But the difference lay in expression. Men endured by marching and fighting. Women endured by counting, rationing, and quietly stretching resources to their limits. The battlefield and the storeroom were two faces of the same Spartan ideal. The unresolved question. Shortages and crises highlight the fragility of a society that prided itself on strength. But they also raise a deeper question. What happened when inventories failed completely, when shortages could not be managed, and when Spartan households faced collapse? The Spartan image is one of unyielding strength, a society that prided itself on stability. Yet even the most disciplined system bent under the weight of circumstance. When inventories failed, when storerooms emptied beyond recovery, Spartan mothers faced choices that shaped not only their households but the endurance of Sparta itself. Their quiet responses to collapse left a legacy that historians too often overlook, hidden beneath the thunder of spears and shields. When the storerooms went empty, to manage scarcity was one thing, to face collapse was another. Some seasons brought such devastation that no rationing could suffice. Droughts that withered crops for consecutive years, helot revolts that cut off harvests, or military campaigns that disrupted labor left households with nothing to count. For Spartan mothers, the empty storeroom was a profound crisis. Obligations to the Syssitia did not vanish. Children still needed to be fed. The gap between expectation and reality became impossible to bridge. In these moments, families risked losing their standing as full citizens, sliding into marginal status, their names remembered not for valor but for failure. Social consequences of failed inventories. In Sparta, the shame of a failed inventory could echo for generations. If a household failed to provide its mess contribution, the male citizen lost his place at the communal table. Without that, he was stripped of equal civic rights, effectively excluded from the circle of Spartan peers. This exclusion carried stigma. A man dishonored in this way could not fully participate in politics or rituals. His sons might face diminished prospects, his daughters fewer suitors. Behind the simple act of missing a food delivery lay cascading social consequences. And who bore the blame? Often, silently, it was the mothers. It was they who oversaw the storerooms, they who were expected to ensure the flow of goods. A mismanaged inventory, or one unable to withstand hardship, could tarnish the household's legacy. Adaptation, survival strategies in crisis. Yet not all stories ended in collapse. Spartan women adapted in ways that reveal their ingenuity and resilience. Exchange and barter. Some women exchanged wool, cloth, or crafted goods for grain or oil from neighboring estates less affected by shortage. Though Sparta frowned upon excessive commerce, quiet exchanges took place out of necessity. Helot exploitation. In extreme cases, demands on helots intensified. Families might seize more from helot households, deepening tensions but sustaining Spartan homes. This was a cruel form of survival, but one tied to the harsh reality of the system. Consolidation of estates. Wealthier women who controlled large tracts of land sometimes absorbed failing estates. Through inheritance or purchase, they managed multiple storerooms, ensuring stability by sheer scale. In this way, Spartan women came to own significant portions of land, a fact that startled outsiders, who often commented on their unusual wealth and autonomy. Austerity within austerity. Some households simply reduced their own consumption to the bone. Spartan ideals already celebrated frugality, but in crises this frugality deepened further. Meals shrank, lamps burned less oil, and every crumb was stretched. Through these strategies, Spartan mothers displayed the same adaptability that their sons showed in battle. The form was different, but the discipline was the same. Inventories and power. Ironically, collapse and adaptation often increased women's power in Sparta. As men died in wars or lost status through failed obligations, women who successfully managed inventories rose in prominence. They inherited land, consolidated estates, and controlled wealth in ways unusual for the ancient world. By the 4th century BCE, commentators observed that Spartan women controlled nearly 2/5 of the land. This concentration of property was not accidental, it was the result of generations of careful household management, where inventories dictated survival. What began as the practical task of counting jars became, in the long view, a redistribution of power. The emotional burden of collapse. Yet the cost of such responsibility weighed heavily. A mother's failure could doom her household. Her success could preserve it for generations. Unlike their Athenian counterparts, Spartan women had no veil of anonymity in domestic life. Their authority over inventories was public, and so too were their failures. The emotional burden was profound. Behind the stern sayings attributed to Spartan mothers, those words of iron urging their sons to return with their shields, lay lives spent in vigilance, anxiety, and careful reckoning. Every empty amphora was a reminder of fragility, every full storeroom a fleeting victory against the chaos of fortune. Legacy of the storeroom. Looking back, it is tempting to see Spartan women only through the lens of independence and wealth, their control of estates remarked upon by ancient writers. But the foundation of that control was inventory work, counting grain, measuring oil, balancing obligation against survival. This legacy shaped Sparta as much as its warriors did. Without mothers who managed storerooms, there would have been no rations for the mess, no supplies for campaigns, no continuity of estates. The famed Spartan army marched on the quiet arithmetic of women at home. Reflection. The story of Spartan mothers and their inventories reveals a truth often hidden in history, that the extraordinary rests upon the ordinary. Behind the clash of spears lay storerooms filled or empty, jars counted or miscounted. Spartan glory depended on these quiet calculations. And so we are left with a question. If the most feared warriors of Greece depended so deeply on the silent inventories of their mothers, how many other great powers of history rested, unnoticed, on the overlooked labors of women in storerooms and kitchens? If you close your eyes and think of Athena, what image comes to mind? Perhaps you see her armored, standing tall with spear and shield, the owl of wisdom perched nearby. You might picture her presiding over debates in the assembly or guiding Odysseus with cunning advice. She is a goddess of war and intellect, strategy and invention. But there is another Athena, quieter and less remembered, the goddess of crafts. Among her many associations, Athena was linked to weaving. This is not surprising, for weaving was central to daily life in ancient Greece, the backbone of domestic economy. Yet within that broad category of craft, ancient sources hint at something more specific, something almost mundane, the art of basket weaving. To imagine Athena weaving baskets is to imagine divinity turning her gaze to the simplest of human needs: containers for carrying grain, storing figs, holding olives, or transporting fish. And it is here, in the weave of reeds and rushes, that we find the understated heart of survival. The basket in daily life. In the modern world, a basket might seem quaint, decorative, even unnecessary. But in ancient Greece, baskets were indispensable. They carried the harvest from fields to storerooms, cradled offerings brought to temples, and stored daily provisions within households. Baskets of varying sizes filled every corner of life. Farmers loaded them with barley and wheat. Fishermen used tightly woven varieties to hold their catch. Market stalls overflowed with baskets filled with figs, grapes, and olives. Even in ritual, baskets held sacred objects during processions. Unlike clay jars or bronze vessels, baskets were lightweight, flexible, and easily made from local reeds, willows, or rushes. They did not last as long, but their impermanence was part of their ubiquity. Every season, new baskets were woven, used, worn down, and discarded. It was a cycle as natural as sowing and harvesting. And so, when Athena was imagined weaving baskets, she was not engaging in a divine distraction, but in a task that touched every layer of Greek society. The technique of basket weaving. Basket weaving, like cloth weaving, required skill and patience. First, materials had to be gathered: reeds from riverbanks, willow branches from groves, rushes dried in the sun. These were softened in water to make them pliable, then stripped into long fibers. The weaver began with a base, often a cross of sturdy reeds. From there, vertical stakes were set up like the ribs of a skeleton. Horizontal fibers were then woven in and out, over and under, spiraling outward in a rhythm that was both repetitive and precise. To keep the weave tight, the weaver pressed down with fingers or small tools, ensuring strength and durability. A basket could take hours or days to complete, depending on its size. Larger storage baskets required significant labor, while small carrying baskets might be made more quickly. No matter the size, the process was one of patience, of deliberate repetition, the kind of boring task that sustains societies. Athena's association with weaving thus extended beyond textiles. The goddess of wisdom was also patron of this rhythm of over and under, the quiet work of hands shaping order out of pliant fibers. Symbolism of the basket. To ancient Greeks, the basket was not only practical but symbolic. In ritual, certain baskets canphoroi were carried by young women in religious festivals, filled with offerings or sacred objects. To be chosen as a basket bearer in the Panathenaic festival was an honor, a sign of a family's prestige. Thus, baskets bridged the gap between the mundane and the sacred. They carried both figs for the market and offerings for the gods. They embodied the duality of Greek life, the ordinary sustaining the extraordinary, the humble serving the divine. When Athena was imagined weaving baskets, she embodied this duality. She was the warrior goddess, but also the goddess who saw divinity in the everyday. The basket was both tool and symbol, a reminder that no society can thrive on glory alone. It must also carry grain, store figs, and provide containers for the most ordinary acts of life. The Weaving Week, a thought experiment. The notion of Athena devoting a week to basket weaving may strike us as fanciful, but consider what it represents. In myth, gods often modeled the tasks expected of mortals. When Demeter taught agriculture, she sanctified the act of sowing grain. When Dionysus introduced wine, he sanctified the vine. In the same way, Athena's weaving sanctified craft. To imagine her taking up basket weaving for a week is to imagine the goddess drawing attention to a task so ordinary it risked invisibility. For 7 days, the goddess might bend reeds, wet rushes, and weave in silence, her divine hands practicing the same motions as mortal women in households across Greece. The lesson is clear. Even the simplest tasks are worthy of divine attention. Basket weaving was not glamorous, but it was essential. By giving it her patronage, Athena acknowledged the quiet foundation of survival. The everyday craft as civic strength. For Athens, this was more than symbolism. The city prided itself on wisdom, but wisdom included practicality. Just as olive trees formed the backbone of the Athenian economy, so too did crafts like weaving ensure that households ran smoothly. Every woven basket represented stored food, transported goods, or sacred offerings delivered to temples. In this sense, the baskets of Athens were silent participants in civic life. Without them, markets would falter, rituals would lack order, and households would struggle to preserve their supplies. Athena's basket weaving was not trivial, it was a reminder that civic greatness rested on ordinary crafts. The unresolved question. And so, as we picture the goddess at her loom of reeds, shaping baskets that would carry figs and olives, we must pause. If even Athena, goddess of wisdom, found meaning in basket weaving, what did it mean for the women and men whose lives were defined by this repetitive labor? Did they see themselves as participating in a divine rhythm, or was it simply work, invisible yet indispensable? If Athena's basket weaving was mythic, the work of real basket weavers was anything but. Day after day, in cramped workshops or under shaded awnings in the Athenian agora, men and women bent reeds and rushes, crafting containers that would soon disappear into the routines of daily life. These artisans rarely appear in the pages of history, overshadowed by philosophers, generals, and playwrights. Yet their baskets traveled farther and carried more weight than many of the words of famous men. The place of basket weavers in society. In Athens, basket weaving occupied a modest place in the spectrum of crafts. Potters produced the amphorae that survive in museums today, their surfaces painted with heroic scenes. Bronze smiths forged armor and tools that gleamed with prestige. Basket weavers, by contrast, created objects that were indispensable but ephemeral. Their works wore out quickly, discarded after a season or two. This ephemerality shaped their social standing. Basket weavers were often free poor citizens, medics, resident foreigners, or even slaves. Their craft did not earn them honor in the assembly or inscription on public monuments. Yet without them, the markets would have lacked containers, temples would have lacked ritual vessels, and households would have struggled to transport goods. Thus, while their names are lost, their hands shaped the very infrastructure of Athenian life. Workshops and materials. The materials of basket weaving were humble but carefully sourced. Reeds were cut from the banks of the Ilissos River. Willow branches were stripped from groves along the countryside. Rushes and straw were dried in the sun. Even thin strips of olive wood, pliant when fresh, could be woven into durable bases. In small workshops, piles of these materials would be sorted and softened in water. Apprentices might prepare fibers while masters guided the weaving. The smell of damp reeds filled the air as workers bent over their craft, repeating motions that echoed across generations. Workshops were rarely grand. A few tools, a knife for cutting, a weight for pressing, a shallow basin for soaking reeds sufficed. The rest was labor, patience, and the rhythm of fingers moving over and under, binding chaos into order. The economy of baskets. Despite their humble nature, baskets played a vital role in Athens' economy. Farmers relied on them to carry grain from the fields to storage pits. Merchants filled them with figs, grapes, or olives for sale in the agora. Fishermen packed their catches into tightly woven containers, lined with leaves or cloth to hold the day's haul. Trade across the Aegean also depended on baskets, particularly for transporting perishable goods. While amphorae carried wine and oil, baskets carried produce that needed ventilation or easy handling. They were lightweight, stackable, and easily replaced. The steady demand meant that basket weavers always had work, though rarely wealth. Their wages were modest, just enough to sustain their households. But their economic role was undeniable. They provided the containers that allowed goods to move, trade to flow, and households to function. Baskets in ritual and religion. The craft also touched religion. In Athenian festivals, baskets carried offerings, grains, fruits, small cakes, and even sacred objects hidden from public view. The role of kane-for young women chosen to carry ceremonial baskets was a mark of family prestige. Though the girls themselves were symbols of purity and civic pride, the baskets they carried were made by the same humble artisans who wove for the marketplace. This juxtaposition is striking. The same woven reed could serve to hold figs for a market stall or sacred objects in a temple procession. The basket's significance depended not on its material, but on its context. In this way, basket weavers unknowingly contributed to both the economy and the sacred order of the polis. The rhythm of work. For basket weavers, life was a rhythm of repetition. Day after day, reeds were softened, bases laid, stakes raised, weaves tightened. The work was not glorious, but it was steady. Apprentices learned by watching, fingers growing calloused as they repeated the same motions. Masters took pride in tight weaves, sturdy rims, and even spacing. The monotony could be numbing, yet it was also meditative. To weave was to lose oneself in a pattern, to participate in a cycle older than the city itself. In that rhythm lay both boredom and quiet dignity. One can imagine why Athena, goddess of craft, might lend her patronage. Basket weaving demanded attention, patience, and skill, the same qualities required of statesmen, soldiers, and philosophers. In its simplicity, it reflected the discipline of wisdom. The invisible hands of history. Yet for all their importance, basket weavers left almost no trace in the historical record. Their baskets decayed, leaving little for archaeologists to recover. Their names were rarely recorded, their work considered too ordinary for inscriptions. And yet, if you walked through Athens in the 5th century BCE, you would see their handiwork everywhere. In markets, in storerooms, in temples, in processions. Their craft was invisible in history but omnipresent in life. This invisibility raises a question. How much of history is built not by generals and philosophers, but by the anonymous hands of artisans whose work sustained the very possibility of greatness? The unresolved question. As Athena wove baskets in myth, so basket weavers labored in reality. Their work bridged the sacred and the mundane, the economy and the household. Yet they remained uncelebrated, their craft disappearing with each worn-out container. And so we are left with a puzzle. If baskets were everywhere, why did their makers vanish from memory? Was it the very ephemerality of their craft, or was it that societies prefer to remember heroes and battles over the hands that carried grain and figs? The basket was never a heroic object. No epic poet sang of its weave, no dramatist staged its crafting on the theater steps. Yet without baskets, much of Athens would have struggled to function. They were containers not only of figs and olives, but of meaning linking trade to survival, women's work to civic ritual, and daily necessity to divine symbolism. When we trace their impact, we uncover how something so ordinary could shape both economy and culture in quiet but enduring ways. Baskets in trade and exchange. Consider Athens' bustling agora. Every day merchants spread their wares before buyers. Amphorae of wine and oil stood tall, bronze tools gleamed, pottery caught the eye with painted scenes. But most produced the figs, grapes, nuts, herbs, and small goods that filled the daily diet arrived in baskets. Merchants relied on woven containers for transport, storage, and display. Buyers judged produce by peering into baskets. Some baskets were left with customers, others returned to sellers after goods were poured into smaller vessels. The agora would have been unthinkable without them, though no one remarked upon their presence. Beyond Athens, baskets were carried on donkeys along dusty roads, loaded onto ships bound for islands and ports across the Aegean. While amphorae carried the more durable exports like olive oil, baskets transported the softer, perishable goods that connected Athens to its neighbors. Thus, trade flowed not only through monumental harbors and decorated ships, but through fragile reeds woven by unseen hands. Women, weaving, and authority. Basket weaving, like cloth weaving, was strongly associated with women's labor. In households, women wove baskets as part of the rhythm of domestic life. They taught daughters the craft, repaired worn containers, and produced new ones each season. This labor reinforced women's role as managers of household resources. To weave a basket was to provide order, a place to store grain, a container to transport offerings, a vessel for daily exchange. It was quiet authority, unrecognized in civic speeches yet essential to household survival. In festivals, this domestic craft crossed into the public sphere. The kainephoroi, young women who carried sacred baskets, symbolized the link between household and polis, private labor and public ritual. Their baskets held not only offerings but also the weight of family honor and civic identity. Through baskets, women's domestic labor found symbolic expression in Athens' grandest ceremonies. Athena's patronage of weaving thus underscored a truth often hidden in historical accounts. Women's crafts sustained the fabric of the city as surely as men's debates and battles. Baskets as symbols of survival. In their simplicity, baskets carried profound symbolic weight. They embodied containment, preservation, and the cycle of use and renewal. Every woven reed represented patience, repetition, and foresight, values essential to survival. This symbolism seeped into language and imagery. Ancient writers occasionally used basket metaphors for order and abundance. In rituals, baskets became vessels of fertility and continuity, carrying grains that symbolized life's renewal. Even when forgotten in historical texts, baskets left quiet traces in the symbolic imagination of the Greeks. Ephemerality and memory. Why then do we know so little about basket weavers? The answer lies in ephemerality. Unlike pottery, which survives in fragments across millennia, baskets decayed. Made of reeds and fibers, they dissolved into soil and dust. Archaeologists find only rare impressions, faint shadows of their weave. This ephemerality shaped memory. History tends to preserve what endures: stone, bronze, fired clay, while forgetting what perishes. The voices of basket weavers, like their works, faded quickly. Yet their absence in the record is itself a reminder. Much of life's foundation rests on things that do not last. Athena's mythical week of basket weaving, then, can be read as an attempt to honor what was otherwise invisible, to lift an ordinary craft into divine light, if only briefly. Reflection, the quiet legacy. In the end, baskets were not about glory but continuity. They carried the grain that sustained families, the figs that sweetened meals, the sacred offerings that bound citizens to gods. They symbolized the intertwining of the humble and the holy, the domestic and the civic. The story of baskets reminds us that history is not only written in marble or bronze. It is also woven from reeds and rushes, from hands repeating simple motions until necessity is met. Athens stood tall in philosophy and politics because it first stood steady on such unremarkable crafts. Closing thought. So what does it mean that Athena herself, goddess of wisdom, was imagined as a basket weaver? Perhaps it is a reminder that wisdom is not found only in strategy or war, but also in patience, in repetition, in the unnoticed labor that sustains life. And so we close with a question. If the most ordinary crafts can carry divine significance, how much of our own daily labor, quiet, repetitive, and invisible, will future generations recognize as the true foundation of our societies? When you think of Athens, you might picture marble temples gleaming in the sun, debates in the agora, or fleets of triremes slicing through the Aegean waves. But beneath the grandeur lay a simple, unyielding truth. Athens could not feed itself. The rocky soil of Attica supported olives and vines well enough, but grain, the staple of daily life, was always in short supply. Barley and wheat grew in patches, but never in sufficient quantities to sustain the city's swelling population. To survive, Athens depended on grain imported from across the sea. And so, while philosophers debated and generals strategized, ships groaned with sacks of grain, sailing from Egypt, the Black Sea, and other fertile regions of the Mediterranean. These shipments, forgotten in grand narratives, were the quiet lifelines of the city. Without them, Athens would have starved, its culture and democracy collapsing not in battle but in empty storerooms. Grain as the foundation of daily life. Bread and porridge were the staples of the Greek diet. While olives, figs, and wine flavored meals, grain provided the bulk of caloric intake. A single household required steady supplies to survive from season to season. In Athens, bread stalls lined the agora. Families purchased flour or loaves, often baked communally in shared ovens. Barley, ground into meal, was cheaper and more common than wheat, but wheat bread was highly prized, especially among the wealthier citizens. The scale of demand was immense. Tens of thousands of mouths needed feeding every day, from citizens and medics to the enslaved laborers who sustained households and workshops. This demand stretched far beyond what Attica's fields could supply. Thus, grain imports were not luxuries, they were necessities. Every sack that arrived at Piraeus, Athens' bustling port, meant another day of survival. The web of grain routes. Grain reached Athens through a web of trade routes that spanned the Aegean and beyond. Egypt, the fertile Nile Delta, produced immense surpluses of grain. Egyptian shipments were reliable and substantial, though subject to political negotiation and occasional disruption. The Black Sea, Pontus, Regions around the Black Sea, particularly modern-day Ukraine, became critical suppliers. Ships laden with grain sailed through the Bosporus and across the Aegean to Athens. Thrace and Sicily. These regions provided supplemental shipments, though often contested by rival powers. This network required careful management. Merchants risked storms, piracy, and shifting alliances. Athens, recognizing the fragility of its lifelines, invested heavily in protecting these routes, sometimes waging war to secure them. Yet at its core, the system depended on the humble act of loading and unloading sacks of grain, season after season, ship after ship. The role of the port of Piraeus. At the heart of this system stood Piraeus, Athens' great port. Fortified and bustling, it was the entry point for the city's survival. Long walls connected it to Athens, ensuring safe passage even during times of war. Here, shipments were received, recorded, and distributed. Officials monitored quantities, merchants negotiated prices, and warehouses filled with imported grain. From Piraeus, grain flowed into the city, sustaining households, supplying the army, and feeding the communal messes. The port was noisy with activity. Stevedores carrying sacks, merchants shouting, scribes marking inventories on tablets. To walk through Piraeus was to witness the lifeblood of Athens in motion, a lifeblood measured not in gold or glory, but in bushels of grain. Bureaucracy of the grain shipments. Athens, ever attentive to order, developed bureaucratic systems to manage grain imports. Inspectors recorded quantities, set price controls to prevent exploitation, and regulated storage. Laws were enacted to ensure that imported grain was sold fairly within the city rather than hoarded by profiteers. Citizens could be fined or punished for manipulating grain prices. In some cases, the state purchased grain directly, distributing it to citizens in times of shortage. The stability of Athens' democracy depended as much on these mundane regulations as on the lofty ideals proclaimed in the assembly. Grain as political leverage. Grain shipments were also political weapons. Allies of Athens were expected to contribute grain as part of their tribute in the Delian League. Rivals sought to cut off Athens' lifelines, knowing that the quickest way to weaken the city was to starve it. In this sense, every sack of grain carried more than food, it carried power. To control grain routes was to control survival. Wars, treaties, and alliances often turned on this quiet but decisive factor. The forgotten laborers. Behind all of this, the laws, the ships, the politics, stood countless anonymous laborers. Men harvested grain in Egyptian fields, sailors loaded it onto ships, stevedores carried it off at Piraeus. Enslaved workers transported it into warehouses, while women at home ground it into flour and baked it into bread. None of their names are remembered, yet their labor sustained Athens as surely as the speeches of Pericles or the strategies of Themistocles. The story of Athens' greatness is incomplete without them. The unresolved question. And so we arrive at a moment of tension. Grain shipments sustained Athens, but what happened when those shipments failed? What crises arose when storms sank ships, when pirates intercepted cargo, or when rivals cut off supply routes? The sea was both a giver and a thief. For every ship that arrived safely at Piraeus with its belly full of grain, there was another that never made it, its cargo swallowed by storms or seized by rivals. Athens' reliance on imported grain meant that the city lived at the mercy of forces beyond its control. When shipments faltered, shortages rippled through households, markets, and the assembly alike. The perils of the sea. Ancient ships were fragile things compared to modern vessels. Built of wood and sealed with pitch, they braved seas notorious for sudden storms. A single gale could scatter fleets, sink merchant ships, and dash amphorae against the rocks of unfamiliar coasts. Merchants, aware of the dangers, often prayed to Poseidon before departure, leaving offerings at shrines along the coast. Yet prayer did not guarantee safety. Archaeological finds of shipwrecks amphorae scattered across seabeds, anchors buried in sand remind us how often these voyages ended in disaster. For Athens, each lost ship was not just a merchant's misfortune but a civic wound. Every sack of grain lost meant another tightening of belts in the city. Piracy and rival powers. Storms were not the only threat. Piracy plagued the Aegean, especially during times of political upheaval. Pirates targeted grain ships, knowing their cargo was both valuable and essential. A single interception could yield enough profit to feed a pirate crew for months. Even more dangerous were rival powers. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta and its allies recognized the strategic value of cutting Athens off from its grain routes. Control of the Hellespont, the narrow strait leading to the Black Sea, became a matter of survival. If Spartan fleets held the strait, grain from Pontus could not reach Athens. Thus, naval battles fought in those waters were not merely contests of pride. They were struggles over bread, porridge, and survival. Shortages in the city. When shipments failed, the effects were immediate. Grain prices in the agora soared. Families who once purchased bread daily found it suddenly unaffordable. Bakers reduced loaf sizes, stretching flour with barley meal or legumes. The poor suffered most, their diets shrinking to the barest sustenance. Households began hoarding what little grain they had, creating further shortages. Tensions rose. Murmurs of discontent spread through the city, for hunger had a way of loosening tongues against leaders. To walk through Athens during a shortage was to feel unease. Markets with fewer goods, storerooms growing emptier, children's cries sharper from hunger. The crisis of grain was not abstract, it was lived daily in kitchens and at communal tables. The state's response. Athens could not afford to let hunger fester. Leaders introduced measures to stabilize supplies and calm unrest. Price controls. Officials set limits on the cost of grain to prevent profiteering. Merchants caught violating these controls faced fines or worse. Public purchase. At times, the city itself bought large shipments of grain, distributing it directly to citizens at controlled prices. Naval protection. Triremes escorted merchant convoys, their oars flashing in rhythm to guard against pirates and enemy fleets. Storage and reserves. Granaries were maintained in Piraeus, though limited capacity meant reserves could never last long. Despite these measures, the balance was precarious. A few bad harvests in Egypt or disruptions in the Black Sea could undo even the most careful planning. Grain riots and political consequences. History records moments when shortages sparked unrest. Crowds gathered in the agora, angry at merchants accused of hoarding or profiteering. Accusations flew in the assembly, with politicians blaming rivals for mismanagement. In some cases, riots broke out, threatening public order. Grain crises could make or break political careers. Leaders who secured shipments were praised as saviors. Those who failed faced disgrace. The lifeblood of democracy, speeches, debates, votes pulsed in rhythm with the arrival or absence of grain ships. The emotional weight of hunger. For ordinary Athenians, shortages were not statistics but lived hardship. Mothers stretched meals with whatever substitutes they could find: lentils, beans, dried figs. Fathers stood in long lines at markets, hopping for fair prices. Children grew thinner, their meals smaller. Hunger pressed into the rhythms of daily life. A reminder that the great city of Athens, with its temples and theaters, depended on sacks of grain arriving safely across treacherous seas. A crisis of identity. Shortages also raised deeper questions. What did it mean for a city that prided itself on independence and power to be so reliant on imports? Could Athens truly claim greatness if it could not feed itself without foreign grain? These questions gnawed at the edges of civic pride. While philosophers discussed justice and virtue, hunger whispered another truth. Survival was fragile, dependent on forces far beyond the control of any assembly or orator. The unresolved question. Thus, Athens faced a dilemma. It could respond to shortages with controls, escorts, and reserves, but could it ever escape its dependence on imported grain? Was there a way to secure permanent stability, or would the city always live at the mercy of sea routes and foreign harvests? By the 5th century BCE, Athens had grown into a city of dazzling power, theaters echoing with tragedies, philosophers debating in the Agora, generals commanding fleets across the Aegean. Yet beneath it all lay an unshakable vulnerability, the dependence on imported grain. Athens could not feed itself, and it knew it. To survive, the city had to transform its weakness into strength by turning necessity into policy, strategy, and empire. Securing the Black Sea routes. The Black Sea, the Pontus Euxinus, became the breadbasket of Athens. From its fertile plains came the grain that fed tens of thousands. But to reach Athens, these shipments had to pass through the narrow straits of the Bosporus and the Hellespont, gateways vulnerable to control by rivals. Athens poured resources into securing these routes. Colonies were established along the Black Sea coast, not merely as outposts of culture, but as anchors for trade. Military campaigns sought to ensure access. Treaties with local rulers guaranteed safe passage. Athenian fleets patrolled the waters, their triremes escorting merchant vessels like guardians of survival. The city understood that whoever controlled the Hellespont controlled Athens' stomach, and so battles fought there obscure to us compared to Marathon or Salamis were in truth struggles over bread. Alliances and tribute. Grain was also embedded in the fabric of Athens' empire. Allies in the Delian League, bound by tribute, were sometimes required to provide grain as part of their obligations. Control of islands and coastal cities was not only about prestige or naval bases, it was about securing reliable supply points for shipments. Athens used its political weight to guarantee deliveries. Cities that resisted risked economic pressure or even military intervention. Grain thus became a tool of diplomacy and coercion, woven into the web of alliances that sustained the Athenian empire. State intervention and civic measures. At home, the state worked to make grain supply part of civic life. Laws regulated grain sales, preventing merchants from exporting supplies elsewhere during times of shortage. Officials known as citiphylax, grain guardians, were appointed to oversee the fairness of transactions and to enforce price controls. In moments of crisis, the city itself purchased grain in bulk, distributing it at subsidized rates. These measures reflected the recognition that hunger was not merely a private issue but a civic threat. A starving citizenry could not sustain democracy, armies, or empire. By tying grain to public policy, Athens wove survival into the very structure of governance. The role of the navy. The famed Athenian navy, symbol of power and freedom, was also a lifeline for grain. Triremes escorted merchant convoys, deterred pirates, and fought rivals over access to supply routes. The Navy's victories meant full storerooms, its defeats, empty stomachs. In this sense, the Navy was not just a tool of conquest but of sustenance. Its wooden hulls carried not only warriors but the invisible weight of bread for the city. Cultural echoes of dependence. Athens' reliance on grain imports shaped its identity in ways that filtered even into culture. Philosophers debated the nature of dependence, the fragility of states, and the balance between necessity and freedom. Playwrights, in comedies and tragedies alike, inserted references to hunger, shortages, and the anxieties of supply. Ordinary citizens, too, lived with the awareness. The sight of ships arriving at Piraeus was not just commerce, it was reassurance, the visible sign that survival had been secured for another season. Fragility revealed. Yet no matter how many alliances Athens forged, how many ships it built, or how many laws it passed, the fragility remained. Grain was a resource grown far away, subject to weather, politics, and war. Athens could delay crisis, mitigate shortages, even dominate routes for a time, but it could never escape dependence. This fragility would later be exploited by rivals. When Athens fell during the Peloponnesian War, it was not only spears and strategies that doomed it but the strangling of its grain lifelines. Starvation weakened resistance, making surrender inevitable. Reflection: invisible foundations. The forgotten grain shipments of the Aegean remind us that empires rise not only on battles and monuments, but on the steady flow of food. Athens, democracy, its art, its philosophy all rested on the backs of anonymous sailors, merchants, and laborers who carried grain across seas. To study Athens without its grain is to study a temple without its foundation. The glory of the Parthenon shines only because storerooms were filled, ovens had flour, and ships kept arriving at Piraeus. Closing thought. In the end, the story of Athens, Grain Lifelines, leaves us with a question. If the greatness of a city depends so deeply on such fragile, invisible flows of goods, how many of our own modern powers rest quietly on similarly overlooked chains of supply? When we think of Rome, we picture legions marching in formation, roads stretching across continents, aqueducts arching over valleys. But what carried Rome forward, quite literally, were its feet. Sandals, boots, and shoes bore the weight of empire, and with footwear came an oddly persistent issue: how to measure, regulate, and standardize sizes in a world that prided itself on order. The Romans, practical to their core, understood that an ill-fitting shoe could slow a soldier, strain a worker, or mark a citizen's status. Thus arose debates, both formal and informal, about how shoes should be made, what sizes should mean, and how cobblers should fit the sprawling variety of Roman feet. It is, on the surface, a trivial matter. Yet in Rome, even the trivial was tied to law, economy, and identity. The everyday Roman shoe. The basic Roman shoe was the calceus, a leather shoe with straps, worn by citizens as a sign of status. Unlike the open sandals of Greece, the calceus enclosed the foot, often dyed black and fastened with leather thongs. To wear the calceus was to declare oneself part of the civic body. Slaves and foreigners were often restricted to simpler footwear like sandals, soli, or boots suited for labor. There were also specialized types. Caligae, heavy-soled boots worn by soldiers, studded with iron nails for durability. Soxae, soft slippers used indoors, favored by actors and those seeking comfort. Cothurni, high boots used in theater, elevating actors both literally and symbolically. Each shoe served a purpose, and each required proper fit. A soldier's caliga too tight could cripple him on a march. A citizen's calceus too loose could slip and shame him in public. The problem of size. Sizing shoes seems simple to us, accustomed to numbers stamped on soles. In Rome, however, there was no universal system. Cobblers measured feet by eye or by rough length, cutting leather accordingly. The results varied. A pair from one workshop might fit differently than from another. As Rome expanded, this problem multiplied. Soldiers recruited from across the empire had feet of all shapes and sizes. Providing standardized footwear for legions became a logistical headache. Stories survive of quartermasters grumbling about ill-fitting boots slowing entire cohorts, forcing adjustments mid-campaign. For civilians, the issue was subtler but still present. Wealthy citizens could afford custom shoes, fitted precisely. The poor relied on cheaper cobblers whose measurements were rougher. Thus, shoe size became not only a matter of comfort but a marker of class. Debates in the forum and the workshop. The Roman obsession with order extended even into shoemaking. Records suggest that guilds of suitors, cobblers, debated methods of measuring feet and cutting leather. Should the standard be based on the length of the sole, the width at the toes, the height of the instep? These technical questions carried practical weight for artisans trying to balance efficiency with accuracy. In the forum, satirists joked about ill-fitting shoes as metaphors for poor governance or mismatched marriages. A shoe too large, one wit remarked, is like a wife too grand, impressive but impossible to manage. The metaphor reveals how shoe size slipped into everyday speech, becoming a symbol of proportion, balance, and adequacy. Law and regulation. Rome, ever fond of regulation, did not leave footwear entirely to chance. Laws concerning soldiers' equipment included specifications for boots, requiring durability and uniformity. Some military decrees mention penalties for cobblers who supplied defective shoes to the legions. Civil law, too, touched on footwear indirectly. Inheritance cases occasionally listed shoes among goods, with disputes over whether pairs were usable or ill-fitting. Even in wills, the question of size appeared: did a bequest of shoes apply to anyone, or only to those whose feet could wear them? These mundane details remind us that Roman law extended into every corner of life, even to the length of a strap or the width of a sole. Feet as markers of identity. Romans also associated feet, and by extension shoes, with identity. To wear the calceus was to claim citizenship. To go barefoot or wear simple sandals was to mark oneself as lower in status. The fit of a shoe became tied to the fit of one's role in society. Even emperors were not exempt. Suetonius notes that Caligula, whose nickname itself comes from the caligae he wore as a child among soldiers, later indulged in bizarre footwear, including women's shoes and theatrical boots. His eccentric choices scandalized Rome, not because of fashion alone, but because they violated the symbolic language of proper shoes. Thus, behind debates about size and fit lay deeper questions of belonging, propriety, and order. The boredom of precision. For cobblers, the work of measuring, cutting, and fitting was repetitive. Day after day, they traced feet, stretched leather, and adjusted straps. Customers complained, shoes wore out, and repairs were constant. Yet within this monotony lay the quiet maintenance of Roman society. Soldiers marched, citizens strode, actors performed, all because cobblers debated how best to measure a foot. It was, in its way, boring history at its finest, unnoticed, repetitive, yet indispensable. The unresolved question. But this raises a larger issue. If Rome prided itself on order and standardization, roads measured in miles, aqueducts calculated with precision, why did shoe sizes remain so inconsistent, debated endlessly in workshops and forums? Was the variability of human feet too resistant to Roman order? Or did the empire simply decide that some things were better left unstandardized? If Roman cobblers wrestled with the problem of shoe sizes in the city, nowhere was the issue more pressing than in the army. The legions were Rome's pride and power, the engine of conquest and control. But the legion marched not on glory, nor even on discipline, but on feet, and those feet required boots. The caliga, boot of the legionary. The standard footwear of a Roman soldier was the caliga, a heavy boot with a thick leather sole, reinforced by hobnails hammered into the bottom. These hobnails gave traction on rough terrain and prolonged the life of the boot, though they also made the shoes clatter loudly on stone. Soldiers laced the caliga high up the leg, leaving much of the foot exposed for ventilation. The design was practical for long marches across varied terrain. Yet it was not one size fits all. Soldiers came from diverse regions of the Empire: Gaul, Hispania, Thrace, Syria, each with different builds, heights, and foot shapes. Fitting them all into standard issue boots proved a constant headache. Logistics of supply. Supplying footwear for tens of thousands of soldiers was no small task. Quartermasters contracted with cobblers and leatherworkers to produce boots in bulk. But without a standardized system of sizing, results varied. Boots might arrive too small, forcing soldiers to cut slits in the leather to relieve pressure. Others were too large, causing blisters and slipping on marches. Adjustments had to be made in the field, with soldiers stuffing boots with cloth, straw, or wool to make them fit. These improvisations reveal how deeply something as mundane as shoe size could affect the effectiveness of the legions. A poorly fitted boot could slow a march, hinder a campaign, and even cost lives. The pain of the march. Ancient writers occasionally mention the hardships of marching, though they rarely dwell on footwear. Still, one can imagine the soldier tramping 30 kilometers a day across stony roads, his ill-fitting caliga rubbing sores into his feet. Blisters turned into infections. Limping slowed the column. Officers punished stragglers, but no discipline could erase the rawness of torn skin inside a boot that did not fit. The empire's conquests, in part, were carried on wounded feet. Attempts at standardization. Roman pragmatism eventually sought solutions. Some units issued boots in a limited range of sizes: small, medium, large, with adjustments made by adding or removing wrappings of cloth. Others experimented with templates cut from wood or bronze to measure feet more consistently. Yet the variability of human feet resisted complete standardization. What worked for one legion might not suit another. Local cobblers often filled gaps, producing custom pairs in camp markets. Soldiers willing to spend their pay secured better-fitting boots, while poorer comrades endured whatever the quartermaster provided. In this way, footwear became a subtle marker of inequality within the supposedly uniform legions. Economic implications. The supply of boots was also an economic opportunity. Contracts for military footwear were lucrative, attracting guilds of cobblers and leatherworkers. Corruption sometimes crept in. Suppliers might cut corners, using thinner leather or fewer hobnails, producing boots that wore out quickly. Complaints about shoddy footwear appear in military correspondence, a reminder that even the mighty Roman army was vulnerable to poor craftsmanship. Just as modern armies contend with faulty equipment contracts, Rome's legions marched in boots shaped by economic incentives as much as by military necessity. Symbolism of the soldier's boot. The caliga carried symbolic weight as well. To wear it was to embody the discipline of Rome. Even emperors recognized this. The infamous Caligula received his nickname from the miniature soldier's boots he wore as a child among his father's troops. Yet behind the symbolism lay practical realities. A boot was only as good as its fit. No amount of Roman discipline or symbolism could erase the discomfort of a soldier limping on a poor shoe. The empire's mythology of invincibility was built, in part, on men enduring something as mundane as blisters. The unresolved question. Thus the debate over shoe sizes extended far beyond cobblers' workshops. It touched the march of armies, the logistics of empire, and the lives of soldiers whose feet bore the weight of conquest. But this raises a deeper question. Did Rome ever truly solve the problem of uniform footwear, or did the empire simply endure it, relying on the resilience of soldiers to march on, no matter how their boots fit? The soldier's boot carried Rome across continents, but beyond the battlefield lay another arena of footwear: the streets, forums, and households of everyday Roman life. Here, the problem of shoe size took on new forms tied to class, fashion, and identity rather than military discipline. Shoes in civilian life. In the city, shoes were more than practical coverings. They were markers of status. The calceus, the classic citizen shoe, was tied so closely to identity that it featured in laws and rituals. To wear it was to declare one's belonging to the civic order. Foreigners, slaves, and laborers wore simpler sandals solely or boots suited for field work. But even within the category of citizen shoes, fit mattered. A wealthy senator seated in the forum could not afford the embarrassment of shoes that pinched or sagged. Fit, though mundane, carried social weight. An ill-fitting shoe suggested carelessness, poverty, or neglect. Fashion and foot size. As Rome expanded, footwear diversified. Influences from the East introduced softer slippers, brightly dyed leathers, and elaborate designs. Fashion began to compete with practicality, and debates arose about what styles were appropriate for men, women, or the elite. Writers of the late Republic and early Empire sometimes mocked men who wore delicate, ill-fitting shoes in pursuit of style. A tight slipper might reveal vanity, a loose one, indifference. Feet became sites of judgment, and shoe size too large, too small a subtle signal of one's social alignment. The poet Juvenal quipped about feet lost in too large slippers, using them as symbols of decadence. Here again, shoe size moved beyond comfort to metaphor, representing proportion, virtue, and balance. Cobblers and customers. In civilian life, cobblers remained at the center of the debate. Workshops dotted the streets of Rome, their stalls filled with leather scraps, awls, and unfinished shoes. Customers visited to have feet measured by eye, to haggle over leather quality, or to request repairs. Complaints about fit were common. Some cobblers developed reputations for precision, attracting wealthier clients. Others churned out cheaper shoes, where size was approximate and adjustments were left to the wearer. This constant tension between custom fitting and bulk production mirrors modern struggles with standardization. Rome never devised a universal shoe sizing system, leaving cobblers and customers in a perpetual dance of adjustment. Shoes in law and ritual. Roman law touched shoes in curious ways. Certain offices required specific footwear, dyed or styled according to tradition. Senators wore the calceus senatorius, a black shoe with straps rising up the ankle. Priests and magistrates donned distinctive pairs for ceremonies. In these cases, size was not just comfort but conformity. To wear the wrong size in ritual footwear could symbolize disorder, a break in the harmony of civic life. Even the most trivial details carried weight when tied to Rome's obsession with tradition and hierarchy. The legacy of fit. Did Rome ever solve the problem of shoe sizes? Not really. Instead, it endured the variability, leaning on custom fitting where possible and tolerating discomfort where necessary. Soldiers stuffed straw into loose boots. Citizens endured pinching straps. Cobblers debated methods endlessly without arriving at universal measures. This persistence reflects a broader truth. Rome, master of roads, aqueducts, and armies, was never fully able to impose order on the variability of the human body. Feet resisted the same standardization that governed milestones and bathhouses. Yet the debate itself left a legacy. Later medieval shoemakers inherited Rome's practices, measuring by hand, improvising fits, and debating proportions without systematizing sizes. Not until the modern age would true standard sizing emerge, and even today, disagreements remain between nations and brands. Reflection, the measure of order. The long debate about shoe sizes in Rome reveals something profound about history, that beneath monuments and victories lie endless negotiations over the ordinary. Feet had to be measured, shoes fitted, and complaints managed. Soldiers endured blisters, citizens judged appearances, cobblers argued over scraps of leather. Rome conquered the known world, but its citizens still argued over shoe fit. The empire's greatness, in a sense, rested on this unresolved ordinariness. Closing thought. So we are left with a question. If Rome, so skilled at imposing order on the vast empire, could never standardize something as simple as shoe size, what does that tell us about the limits of human systems and about the stubborn individuality of the human body that resists being measured into neat categories? When we imagine ancient Egypt, our minds fill with pyramids rising against desert skis, hieroglyphs carved into stone, and golden masks glittering in tombs. Yet beneath these monumental images lay a quieter reality, the daily work of writing. And writing in Egypt meant papyrus. Papyrus was the lifeblood of Egyptian administration. It carried tax records, religious texts, inventories, medical treatises, love poems, and the wisdom of scribes. Without papyrus, The machinery of the state would have faltered, temples would have lost their prayers, and scribes would have sat idle. But papyrus was not infinite. It had to be cultivated, processed, cut, and distributed. And in a land where every sheet carried weight, scribes were often faced with a mundane but pressing task: balancing the papyrus budget. The value of papyrus. Papyrus was made from the stalk of the papyrus plant, harvested from the marshes of the Nile. Stalks were sliced into thin strips, laid in crisscross layers, pressed, and dried into sheets. The result was durable, smooth, and uniquely Egyptian, so distinctive that the very word paper descends from papyrus. Because of its utility, papyrus became one of Egypt's prized exports. Scrolls traveled across the Mediterranean, supplying scribes in Greece, Rome, and beyond. Yet within Egypt itself, papyrus was not a casual commodity. It was controlled, measured, and rationed. A sheet might carry a tax receipt, a letter between officials, or the opening lines of a hymn. Each use required justification, for papyrus represented both material cost and administrative trust. Scribes as budget managers. Egyptian scribes were more than writers. They were accountants of ink and papyrus alike. Their duties extended to tracking not only the words inscribed, but the resources used to inscribe them. In temple schools and administrative offices, scribes received allocations of papyrus. Each roll had to be accounted for. Misuse or waste could mean reprimand. Clever scribes learned to stretch their supplies, cutting sheets carefully, reusing scraps for drafts, and writing densely to conserve space. Some surviving documents reveal notes crammed into margins, or corrections squeezed between lines, evidence of scribes eking out every inch of papyrus. What might look messy to us was, in truth, a strategy of conservation. The hierarchy of use. Not all papyrus was created equal. Fine quality sheets, smooth and uniform, were reserved for official decrees, temple rituals, and literary works meant to endure. Rougher sheets, with visible fibers or uneven surfaces, were used for drafts, school exercises, or ephemeral records. Scribes had to decide what deserved the best papyrus and what could be consigned to cheaper stock. This hierarchy reflected the values of Egyptian society. Gods received the finest offerings, pharaohs the most durable decrees, while merchants or farmers making routine petitions received more modest sheets. The budget was not just financial but symbolic, a reflection of who and what mattered most. Recycling and reuse. Scarcity drove innovation. When papyrus was scarce, scribes reused it. Old documents could be scraped clean and overwritten, a practice later known in Greek as palimpsest. Drafts might be written on the reverse side of a scroll. Broken scraps, too small for full texts, carried brief notes or accounts. This recycling reveals a pragmatic side of Egyptian scribes. They were not only preservers of tradition, but managers of scarcity. Each reused scrap tells a story of careful resource management, invisible yet essential to the smooth running of the state. Papyrus in the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy of Egypt depended on papyrus as much as it did on grain. Taxes were recorded on scrolls. Inventories of cattle, tools, and harvests filled columns of ink. Court cases, contracts, and decrees required documentation. For administrators, the papyrus budget was not abstract. A shortage could delay records, disrupt communication, or hinder the collection of taxes. Just as modern offices stall without paper or ink, ancient Egypt's bureaucracy slowed when scrolls ran thin. Scribes thus became guardians of continuity, ensuring that the flow of documents and, by extension, the flow of authority never stopped. Daily life of a scribe. To picture a scribe balancing the papyrus budget is to picture a man seated cross-legged, reed pen in hand, scroll unrolled before him. Around him, stacks of partially used papyrus lay ready. He dips his pen in ink, pauses to consider spacing, writes carefully, and then shifts the scroll to make room for more. At day's end, he tallies not only the words written but the sheets consumed. He reports to superiors how many rolls remain, what they were used for, and what is still needed. His labor is both intellectual and logistical, part scholar, part accountant. It is, by all accounts, a boring task. Yet it is precisely this dull arithmetic that held together the grand machinery of Egyptian civilization. The unresolved question. And so we are left with a curious thought. In a land of monumental stone and eternal tombs, the daily survival of the state rested on fragile sheets of papyrus. How did Egypt manage the tension between abundance in its fields and scarcity in its writing supplies, and what happened when demand outstripped supply? Papyrus might have been born in the marshes of the Nile, but its life stretched far beyond Egypt's borders. From Alexandria to Athens, from Memphis to Rome, scrolls carried knowledge, commerce, and administration. Yet no resource, however abundant in its homeland, was immune to scarcity. When papyrus supplies faltered, the consequences rippled through bureaucracy, scholarship, and trade. Scribes, caught in the middle, bore the responsibility of making ends meet, stretching rolls, reusing scraps, and rationing their most precious tool. Seasonal and regional variability. Papyrus depended on the rhythms of the Nile. A good flood meant flourishing stalks in the delta marshes. A poor flood meant thinner, weaker plants. Variability in harvests could directly affect the quality and quantity of papyrus sheets available. In prosperous years, warehouses filled with stacks of rolls, and scribes wrote more freely. In lean years, supplies dwindled. Officials might prioritize state records and temple texts, leaving merchants, schools, and private writers with inferior sheets or none at all. Even within Egypt, distribution was uneven. Memphis or Thebes might receive shipments while provincial scribes struggled. Balancing who received papyrus and how much became a delicate administrative task. Papyrus as an export commodity. By the late period, papyrus was not only a domestic necessity but an international commodity. Greek city-states, and later Rome, prized Egyptian papyrus for their own records and literature. Exports could bring wealth to Egypt but also strain supplies at home. Some rulers prioritized foreign trade, seeing papyrus as a diplomatic tool. A shipment of scrolls could cement alliances, pay tribute, or curry favor with distant rulers. But every roll shipped abroad was one fewer for Egyptian scribes. Thus, the papyrus budget became a balancing act not only within Egypt, but across the Mediterranean. The crisis of competition. The rise of pergamon in Asia Minor brought one of the most famous papyrus crises. According to later accounts, Egyptian rulers restricted papyrus exports to stifle Pergamon's growing library, rival to Alexandria. Whether fully true or not, the story reflects the awareness that papyrus was not limitless. Denial of supply could be used as political weapon. For scribes within Egypt, such competition meant tighter rationing. When exports consumed the best rolls, local bureaucrats had to make do with lesser stock. Complaints surely echoed in offices where officials struggled to document taxes or decrees with inferior materials. Shortages in bureaucracy. When papyrus ran short, administration slowed. Tax collection might be delayed if receipts could not be issued. Court cases might stall without written records. Inventories could be held back, leaving warehouses unchecked. In such times, scribes improvised. Some switched to ostraca shards of pottery used as writing surfaces. Others reused old papyrus, scraping away earlier ink. These makeshift measures worked in the short term but lacked the durability and prestige of fresh scrolls. For citizens, shortages meant frustration. A farmer awaiting a record of paid taxes might be told to wait until more papyrus arrived. A merchant seeking a contract could receive a note scribbled on pottery instead of the formal scroll he expected. These inconveniences, while minor compared to famine or war, eroded the smooth functioning of civic life. The burden on scribes. Shortages fell heaviest on scribes, who bore responsibility for balancing demands against limited supplies. They had to decide which documents merited full scrolls and which could be relegated to scraps. Every choice carried consequences. Granting fine papyrus to a temple hymn might mean denying it to a tax receipt. Favoring official decrees over private letters risked resentment. Scribes walked a narrow line, balancing loyalty to the state, service to the gods, and the expectations of ordinary citizens. This burden was not glamorous, but it was real. Behind the facade of Egypt's eternal order lay daily negotiations over sheets of papyrus. Innovation born of scarcity. Scarcity also sparked innovation. When papyrus was scarce, scribes wrote more compactly, inventing shorthand notations or condensing formulaic phrases. They trained apprentices to minimize wasted space, to align columns tightly, and to avoid extravagance in ornamentation. These practices reveal the adaptability of Egyptian writing culture. Even in shortage, the work continued, though in a more constrained form. Words bent to the limits of available sheets, showing how culture itself adjusted to material constraints. The unresolved question. Scarcity raises a deeper issue. Papyrus was fragile, finite, and costly to manage. Could Egypt ever truly balance the demands of state, temple, trade, and ordinary people? Or was the papyrus budget always a compromise, a fragile balance maintained by scribes who bent words and space to fit the narrow margins of supply? Egypt's relationship with papyrus lasted for millennia. From the earliest dynasties to the later Roman era, scrolls unfurled across desks, temple courts, and palace chambers. But no resource endures forever. Papyrus management was a constant act of balance, and eventually, both material and empire faced decline. To understand the legacy of papyrus budgeting is to see how an entire civilization organized itself around fragile reeds, and how that fragility shaped the endurance of Egypt's written world. Administrative discipline. First, papyrus budgeting left a legacy of discipline. Egyptian administration was famous for its order: taxes counted, inventories recorded, harvests tracked. Behind this order stood scribes who learned from their earliest training to treat papyrus as both precious and finite. The meticulousness of Egyptian records visible in surviving scrolls of tax rolls, census lists, and temple accounts reflects not only intellectual rigor but material necessity. Every column of hieroglyphs was shaped by awareness of the cost of papyrus. This habit of careful recording influenced neighboring cultures. Greek administrators who encountered Egypt marveled at its scribal traditions. Romans, inheriting papyrus as a staple of their bureaucracy, continued the Egyptian practice of linking state power to written documentation. The decline of papyrus dominance. Yet papyrus was never invulnerable. As centuries passed, alternatives emerged. In Pergamon, cut off from Egyptian supplies, scribes developed parchment writing surfaces made from animal skins. Parchment was more durable and reusable, though more labor-intensive to produce. Over time, parchment gained ground, particularly in regions less reliant on the Nile. By the late Roman and early Byzantine periods, papyrus was slowly displaced as parchment codices replaced scrolls. Egypt remained the heart of papyrus production for centuries, but the gradual shift reveals the limits of depending on a single material. Just as shortages in one era forced scribes to reuse scraps, larger historical shifts forced entire cultures to seek alternatives. Knowledge preserved and lost. The fragility of papyrus also shaped what survived. Countless scrolls, once neatly budgeted and carefully filled, have crumbled into dust. Only fragments endure: tax receipts, medical texts, letters preserved in the dry sands of Egypt. This selective survival is itself a legacy of budgeting. scribes who economized by reusing scraps sometimes left behind casual notes that outlasted grander works. Today, scholars learn as much from discarded fragments of grocery lists as from temple hymns. The choices scribes made under pressure what to reuse, what to conserve ripple through the historical record. In this way, the papyrus budget continues to shape our understanding of the ancient world. Symbolism of fragility. There is also symbolism in papyrus, fragility. Stone monuments proclaim eternity, yet daily governance relied on materials that decayed within centuries. The Egyptians built pyramids to last forever but trusted their bureaucracy to fragile scrolls. This duality, permanence in stone, impermanence in papyrus, captures something essential about civilization. Glory is carved in monuments, but survival is written on paper. And it is often the fragile, everyday medium that sustains life most directly. The end of the papyrus era. By late antiquity, papyrus production dwindled. Political instability, shifting trade routes, and the rise of parchment reduced its dominance. By the medieval period, papyrus was largely forgotten, its name lingering only in the word paper. Yet the habits it instilled remained. Careful record-keeping, rationing of supplies, and the discipline of scribal accounting carried forward into new mediums. The budgeting of papyrus gave way to the budgeting of parchment, and later of paper, ink, and books. The thread of continuity lay not in the material but in the mindset. The awareness that writing resources are never infinite and must be managed with care. Reflection, the scribe's legacy. The Egyptian scribe, balancing scrolls and ink, might have seemed engaged in dull work, counting sheets, rationing lines, reusing scraps. Yet his labor sustained one of the world's great civilizations. Without him, taxes would have gone unrecorded, rituals unpreserved, decrees unheard. His discipline echoed across centuries, shaping the very way societies thought about writing, memory, and preservation. And his struggles with scarcity remind us that even the greatest cultures rest on fragile foundations. Closing thought. So we are left with a final reflection. If the vast machinery of Egypt could be both sustained and constrained by the availability of papyrus, what does that tell us about the fragility of our own knowledge, dependent still on materials that may one day crumble or vanish? When we think of Athens, we imagine lofty debates in the assembly, philosophers in the agora, or generals commanding fleets across the Aegean. Yet the daily reality of the polis rested on something far less glamorous: taxes. And behind the ledgers of Athenian finance stood minor officials, anonymous men whose duty was to track, collect, and account for the endless trickle of coin and goods that sustained the city. This is the story of one such figure, not a statesman or general, but a minor tax collector. His name has been lost to time, yet his work left faint traces in inscriptions, decrees, and the daily machinery of governance. By reconstructing his tasks, we glimpse a world of paperwork, negotiations, and tedious precision. It is perhaps the very definition of boring history, but boring in this case sustained democracy. The role of the tax collector. Athens' financial system was a patchwork of levies: customs duties on imports and exports, market taxes on sales, tribute from allies, property assessments, and occasional direct levies in times of war. While the wealthy often contributed through liturgies, public services funded from their fortunes, the backbone of everyday revenue came from ordinary taxes collected at ports, markets, and rural districts. The minor tax collector was not a grand treasurer but a mid-level functionary. He was responsible for ensuring that assessments made by higher officials were actually gathered, recorded, and reported. He stood at the intersection of law, commerce, and daily life, a man whose duty was to transform obligations into coin. The collector's desk. To picture his world, imagine a cramped office near the agora or in the port of Piraeus. The collector sits behind a wooden desk, scrolls stacked beside him, a wax tablet ready for quick notes. Beside him lies a chest for coin and a balance scale for weighing silver drachmas. Citizens file in, merchants approach with goods, sailors unload cargoes. Each transaction requires attention. Is the correct tariff paid? Does the measure match the declaration? Are exemptions justified? The collector notes each detail with a scribe's hand, his reed pen scratching across papyrus. The work is slow, repetitive, and precise. The weekly rhythm. The collector's week is defined not by drama, but by repetition. Each day brings a flow of payments. Farmers delivering a portion of produce. Merchants paying duties on imported goods. Artisans contributing market fees. On market days, the office grows crowded, with disputes over amounts, weights, or exemptions. On quieter days, the collector tallies accounts, checking sums against previous records. The rhythm is steady but unrelenting, the sort of work that erodes the sense of time. A week blurs into a month into a season, all marked by endless columns of numbers. Tools of the trade. The collector's tools were deceptively simple: scales, measures, tablets, scrolls. Yet each represented the city's effort to impose fairness and order. Weights were checked against official standards stored in temples. Measures of grain or oil had to conform to civic norms. If a merchant's measure was found wanting, penalties followed. If coinage seemed debased, it was weighed carefully to detect fraud. Thus, the collector stood not only as a recorder of payments but as a guardian of civic trust. The social position. As a minor official, the collector occupied an ambiguous social space. He had authority but little glory. Citizens resented him when he demanded payments, yet depended on his diligence to keep the city functioning. He was neither celebrated like a general nor reviled like a tyrant, but tolerated as a necessary figure. His role required patience, caution, and a thick skin. Complaints were constant. Farmers insisted taxes were unfair, merchants argued over rates, and citizens accused him of corruption. He had to navigate these with diplomacy, for a misstep could lead to fines or dismissal. The boredom of detail. To us, the collector's life seems monotonous, recording figures, weighing goods, stamping approvals. Yet in this monotony lay the stability of Athens. Without these details, revenues would falter, markets would stall, and even the great debates of the assembly would lose their foundation. The collector's boredom was the polis's security. The unresolved question. But this raises a larger issue. How did a city that prided itself on freedom and citizen equality reconcile itself with the tedious necessity of taxation, and what tensions arose between civic ideals and the daily grind of tax collection? The life of a minor tax collector was never simple. While the system looked orderly on papyrus scrolls and decrees, reality was far messier. Athens was a city that valued freedom, and its citizens were never shy about challenging authority. When money was at stake, disputes were inevitable. Common disputes. The most frequent disputes revolved around measurements and exemptions. A farmer delivering grain might insist his sacks were lighter than assessed. A vintner might argue that his wine was exempt from certain duties because it came from his own vines rather than imports. A merchant might claim that his goods had already been taxed at another port. Each claim required verification, often on the spot. The collector weighed grain against official standards stored in temples, measured liquids in state-approved jars, and cross-checked lists from other offices. These moments turned the collector into both judge and bureaucrat. Disputes could drag on, with tempers flaring. Citizens prided themselves on their rights, and shouting matches in the tax office were not uncommon. Some stormed away in frustration, leaving the collector to mark the unpaid levy in his records, knowing it might mean a court case later. Evasion and resistance. Evasion was another constant challenge. Merchants tried to sneak goods past checkpoints, hiding imports in larger shipments. Farmers underreported yields, hopping to reduce their obligations. Some citizens simply refused to pay, forcing the collector to escalate the matter to higher authorities. The port of Piraeus was particularly notorious for evasions. With hundreds of ships arriving and departing, cargo could easily slip through unnoticed. Collectors relied on inspectors at the docks, but bribes and negligence undermined enforcement. Every coin that escaped collection weakened the city's finances and reflected poorly on the collector responsible. For a minor tax collector, vigilance was essential, yet constant suspicion bred tension. Too much leniency invited fraud, too much severity risked accusations of tyranny. The court as backstop. When disputes could not be settled in the office, they spilled into the courts. Athens' legal system allowed citizens to challenge officials, and tax cases were no exception. A collector accused of unfair assessment might find himself defending his judgment before a jury of fellow citizens. These cases were tedious, filled with arguments over weights, measures, and records. Yet they reveal the democratic texture of Athenian life. Even the humblest farmer could confront an official, forcing him to justify his actions. For the collector, court appearances were both a hazard and a relief. Hazard because a poor defense could end his career. Relief because the responsibility for judgment shifted from his desk to the jury box. Corruption and suspicion. The constant disputes and evasions also bred suspicion of corruption. Collectors had opportunities to accept bribes to look the other way on a shipment, to underreport a farmer's yield, to falsify records. Some succumbed, enriching themselves quietly. Others resisted, knowing that discovery could mean disgrace. Even honest collectors were often accused. A citizen unhappy with his levy might mutter that the official was pocketing extra drachmas. In a democracy where public scrutiny was constant, a minor tax collector had to live with the shadow of suspicion, whether deserved or not. The collector's burden. These daily disputes and evasions made the collector's work exhausting. His task was not only to record numbers, but to manage people, their tempers, excuses, and grievances. He was part accountant, part mediator, part enforcer. The burden was heavy for such a minor position. The collector had little prestige, modest pay, and constant stress. Yet his diligence mattered. Every coin collected contributed to the fleet, the festivals, the grain supply, and the very functioning of the polis. A week in conflict. Imagine his week. On Monday, a farmer disputes the weight of grain. On Tuesday, a merchant insists his imports are exempt. On Wednesday, a sailor tries to sneak cargo past inspectors. On Thursday, a craftsman accuses the collector of corruption. On Friday, the collector is summoned to court. Each case consumes time, ink, and patience. Each leaves him weary, yet his records must be updated and his superiors satisfied. The unresolved question. All this raises a pressing issue. Could Athens truly reconcile its ideals of freedom and citizen equality with the realities of taxation, disputes, and enforcement? Or did these constant tensions reveal the fragility of its democratic system? By the week's end, the tax collector is tired. His scrolls are filled with figures, his wax tablets scratched with quick notes, and his coin chest heavy with drachmas weighed and reweighed. The disputes, evasions, and accusations of corruption linger in his mind, but so too does a quiet recognition. Without his work, the city would falter. Athens' glory, its navy, theaters, temples, and festivals all required coin, and every coin passed at some point through the hands of men like him. The flow of revenue. Each evening, the collector reported totals to higher officials. Coins were tallied, sealed in bags, and sent to the city's treasuries. Grain or other goods were recorded in inventories, marked for storage or redistribution. The numbers he entered became the backbone of Athenian accounts. From them, the assembly debated budgets, funded triremes, or decided subsidies for festivals. His careful columns of figures flowed upward into the grand decisions of democracy. What seemed at his desk a dull tally of payments became, at the level of the polis, the foundation of civic life. The collector and the navy. One of the most direct links between his work and Athens' survival was the navy. The fleet of triremes that secured trade routes and defended the city was funded through taxes. The silver coins he collected might purchase timber for ships, pay rowers' wages, or supply food for sailors. Thus, though he never commanded a vessel, the collector's labor sustained the very power that allowed Athens to project strength across the Aegean. His week of disputes and ledgers translated into oars striking water, sails unfurling, and fleets ready for war. The cultural sphere. Taxes also funded Athens' cultural life. Theater festivals like the Dionysia, where tragedies and comedies were performed, relied on public funds. So too did temple sacrifices, civic celebrations, and subsidies that allowed poorer citizens to attend performances. The collector's work, then, reached into art and religion as well. The coin gathered from a reluctant farmer might, months later, pay for the chorus in a new tragedy or the sacrificial bull in a festival. In this way, even the mundane contributed to the grandeur of Athenian culture. The weight of responsibility. For all this, the collector remained a minor figure. His name, unlike Pericles or Themistocles, did not echo through history. His role was often thankless, his honesty questioned, his patience tested. Yet his responsibility was immense. He lived with the knowledge that mistakes in his ledgers, lapses in enforcement, or failures in judgment could ripple outward into shortages of funds, weakened defenses, or missed opportunities. Boring as his work seemed, it carried weight. The invisible foundation of democracy. The collector's week reveals a deeper truth. Democracy depended not only on citizens debating in the assembly, but also on officials maintaining ledgers, weighing coins, and chasing evasions. Freedom and equality rested on the ability of the polis to fund itself, and that funding relied on tedious, often resented, labor. This is the paradox of Athens. The ideals of liberty and participation flourished only because ordinary officials endured the drudgery of taxation.